Hi, I'm Adam Taylor for AE Tuts Plus. Today I'm going to show you a range of techniques that we use to create this pseudo 3D pack shot using nothing more than some still photos and After Effects. First though, I want to thank the guys at Technosource for allowing me to use the copyrighted images that I used in the original ad. Secondly, I want to thank Andrew Kramer at Video Copilot because one or two of the techniques I will use today were inspired by some of his great tutorials. I'm going to break down the tutorial into sections showing techniques rather than the entire process, because with so many elements in the finished ad it could get very confusing very quickly. The techniques I'll be showing will be importing and prep work, anchor points, using expressions to create a baseline, scaling, camera moves, sequencing the layers, creating reflections and shadows, and creating a 3D logo. Once in After Effects, create a new project. I'm in the UK, so we'll use a PAL widescreen format, a duration of 4 seconds. Name it Smiley Final. Hit File, Import, Import File, select the smileyproducts.psd, then select the option Import as Composition. Initially I tried the import layers using the cropped layer option, but found that caused some odd complications later on, so I've opted not to use that method for this project. You will be asked if you want to import editable layer styles or merge them. Unfortunately, we don't really want either, but as that's not an option, the easiest way is to keep the layer styles editable. This way, they don't get baked into the image, which could possibly cause more problems further down the line. Now, double click on the Smiley Products comp icon and you'll see a black screen filled with various Smiley products, all at differing sizes and positions. That's because this file is the original layout used to create a catalogue page layout. I've already removed all the text and graphics that we don't need. If you open a layer, you'll see the layer styles are included. You can easily get rid of these, but as we won't be working in this comp, it's not really that important. The method would simply be to highlight the layers, go to Layers, Layer Styles, and remove all. Now, double click on the Smiley Final comp to open it, and then in the project window, open the folder Smiley Products Layers, select all the layers within and drag them into your timeline. Doing it this way, the layers will not bring the layer styles with them. Now, I need to create a mask around each image using the rectangle tool. The easiest way to see which layer you're working on is with the solo button. Once it's clicked, you'll only see that layer until you either switch it off again or select more solo buttons. Check your soloed layer is selected, and with the rectangle tool draw a box around the image. You may also want to rename the layers as you go, which can be done by selecting the layer, then hitting the return key to highlight the text box. Do this for all the layers. I'll be working in a 3-dimensional comp, so select all the layers and click the 3D layer icon. The next step is to colour code the layers, based on the size of the actual products. As you can see, these images are all odd sizes, but the final movie will need the products all to appear correct in relation to each other. I have the benefit of actually having samples to compare, so I'll group all the products based upon their actual sizes. Select each layer in a specific size group and click the Layer Colour tab to pick a colour. I chose yellow, blue and green for the 3 distinct groups. I also made sure that the colour-coded layers are all grouped together on the timeline. To make the timeline less crowded, you can use the Hide Layer icon. Just to the right of the layer name is a small button that looks like a head behind a wall. If you click it, the head drops behind the wall. So what, you might ask? Well, if you activate the large version of the same icon on the buttons across the top of the timeline, you'll cause all the activated layers to vanish from the timeline, even though they remain visible in the comp window. But beware, if the layer was selected before you hit vanish, it will remain selected even though you can't see it, so it can still be affected by your actions until you've deselected it. Before I activate the hide on all layers except the yellow ones, I'm going to switch off the invisibility icons on all the other layers, just to make the screen a little bit easier to get my head round. Each group of images will need to be standing in a row and be of equal size. Without moving the anchor point, achieving this will be really difficult. The anchor point is the small dotted circle with crosshairs, and it is the point around which all the transform properties are centered. You can move it numerically using the anchor point transform properties, but a more tactile and intuitive way is to use the pan behind tool, which has the keyboard shortcut of Y. The icon looks like a square inside a diamond inside a square. To use it, first select your layer, hit the solo button to hide the other images, hit Y to activate the pan behind tool. Your cursor will add a dotted circle to the arrow so you know you've got the tool selected. Then click and drag the anchor point to the centre of the underside of the image, soles of the feet for example. Pick the point where you would want the image to contact a floor. As you can see, rotations will be centred around this point, as will any scaling that you do. It's also the point used by the position parameter as the layer's centre point. Now repeat this process to reset every layer's anchor point. Before I start to scale the images, I want to create a baseline they can all stand on. I also know that I will be cheating the three-dimensional image later on, so I want to be able to position each group on its own floor. But I will also want the freedom to move the individual images in both the X and Z axes to help compose the shot. The way I chose to do this is with an expression that will take the Y-axis data from a null object but will ignore both the X and Z axis data. To do this, go to Layer, New, Null Object, rename the null object as Yellow Positioner, then select an image layer and hit P to open the Transform Position properties. Holding the Alt key, click on the Position stopwatch to activate the expression text box. Enter the following expression: open bracket value, open bracket 0, close bracket, comma, this comp dot layer, open parentheses, quote marks, yellow positioner, quote marks, close parentheses, dot transform, dot position, open bracket 1, close bracket, comma, value, open bracket 2, close bracket, close bracket. Sounds a little complicated, but it's not really when you look at what it's doing. The expression is split into three sections by the commas. The first section, known as open bracket 0, close bracket, equates to the x-axis, and value tells the expression to retain the value already assigned to the parameter. The second section, which is known as open bracket 1, close bracket, that equates to the y-axis, and it simply tells After Effects to look at the layer called Yellow Positioner, which can be found in this comp, then copy the Transform Position property that it finds in the corresponding y-axis and put it into this layer's y-axis position. The third section is known as bracket 2 bracket and relates to the z-axis. Again, by using the value command, it's telling After Effects to retain the value that you already had in this field. Click away from the text box to accept it, then select it again and highlight all the expression and copy it. In each layer in the group, hit the Alt stopwatch, then paste the expression into the text box. When you've finished, you should see all the images on the same y-axis. Select the Yellow Positioner layer and try moving it around. Regardless of how you move this layer, you will only affect the y-axis of the other images. If you try to move the position of an individual image, you will only be able to move the X and Z axis. In effect, what you've done is created a kind of artificial gravity. Now repeat this process for each group of images, but remember to create a new positioner null layer for each group and change the expression used so that it refers to the correct positioner. The final comp will show a range of products of 4 different sizes, so we need to make sure that the images we use are accurately scaled in relation to each other. To do this, pick one layer from each group to act as the reference layer for its own group. Hide all the other layers and images. Pick the image which shows the largest product, which is the backpack image. All others must be smaller, so we won't be losing any image quality by having to scale anything up by too much. Hit S to open the scale properties. Now you can adjust the scale of the other images until they're all in proportion to each other. Once you've done that, you need to open each group in turn and scale the other images in the group so that they match the size of your reference image. You can also begin to arrange the images to create a pleasing composition. If you want a more natural look, consider positioning the images so that they overlap a little. This will help keep the overall composition a little more compact as well. So alternately adjust the Z-axis by a few pixels to locate some images slightly behind their neighbours. Bearing in mind that each group will need to be positioned approximately 130 pixels apart on the Z-axis, select all the layers in a single group, change the Z position so that the yellow layer is at 130, the green layer is at 0, the blue layer is at minus 160, and I also positioned the backpack layer a little further away at 407. To create the animation needed to bring each image on screen one after the other, we first need to change the order the layers are stacked in the timeline. We want the images to appear starting at the back, moving forward from left to right. So drag the images in your timeline so that the back layer is at the top and each consecutive layer is below it. The reason will be made apparent in a moment. Now, hide all non-image layers such as positioners and cameras. You should find that your timeline looks similar to this, with each group of colours blocked together. To sequence the images, we could use opacity keyframes to individually bring each image into view, but this would take ages to do. The easy way is to select the layer you want first in the sequence, then hold Shift and select the layer that you want last in the sequence. Then you select Animation, Keyframe Assistant, Sequence Layers. In the pop-up box, set a duration of 323 and make sure overlap is ticked. Hit OK. You'll see the layers are now staggered with a separation of 2 frames. That's because it's a 4-second sequence, and in PAL there's 25 frames to a second. We set the sequence to overlap by 323, meaning each layer should be visible for 2 frames before it becomes overlapped by the next layer. The sequence will always be determined by the order you select the first and last layers. Now I want to add a camera before I start adding the reflections, because that's really going to slow things down. So we go to Layer, New, Camera. I've got the 50mm lens and I've switched off Enable Depth of Field. Before I do anything else, I'm going to switch my resolution to 1/4 just to speed things up, because we've got a lot of layers now and we're going to start animating. It's a 4-second piece. So I want the animation to kind of come to an ease about a second before the end. So if I position my cursor at the 3-second point, and then I'm going to select the camera tool. Now with this tool you can move up and down, left and right. If you hit the C key, you can, each time you hit the key you can scroll through the different camera modes. So I just want to zoom the camera back a little bit and bring it down, but I also want to rotate the camera slightly, so we're slightly higher looking down on it. That's a bit too much. Well, that's quite a nice end shot, leaving enough room there for any extra graphics that you may need on your pack shot. So now, rather than animate the camera, I'm going to use that as my final shot, and I don't want to affect the camera anymore, because it's fairly easy to lose what you're doing with the camera. So what I do is I'll go for Layer, New, Null Object. Change the name to Camera Control, and then parent the camera to the null object, and then lock your camera. So now you can't actually move the camera around, but what you can do is move the controller around. I'm just going to be using, I did forget to make this a 3-dimensional null object, which we need for this. So I'm going to set a position keyframe at 3 seconds, and I'm also going to set one on the Y rotation value. And then I'm going to go to beginning of the timeline, maybe about 10 frames in, and I'm going to adjust the Y rotation, change the position, and just quickly check how it moves. Yeah, I like that. Now we're going to ease in the keyframes. So if we select both the beginning keyframes, hold the control key and click on one of those keyframes, scroll down to keyframe assistant and then down to easy ease out. Now you could just use the easy ease function across all of your keyframes, but I personally prefer the individual versions. I think they're a little nicer. And you always want to start with an out and finish with an in, because it's not referring to moving into the effect, it's referring to moving out of the keyframe. The way I always think of it is you set out on a journey and you pull in at the end. So I always use out and in that way around. So go down to the end points, do the same again, select them all, click on control and the keyframe, choose keyframe assistant, easy ease in. And then if we play that back, I don't like that. I'm going to move the endpoint to the beginning. I think it'll just look a little neater. Yeah, that'll do for the camera move. Okay, now we're going to make the reflections, but because the way we've made this is layered groups in three-dimensional space, we're going to need a separate reflection layer for each group. Otherwise, as soon as we do the camera move, it's going to break the illusion. The way that we do this is by putting the timeline into full screen mode with the tilde key, and select everything from positioner 3 down to the bottom of the timeline, which is playtime. Select them all. Apple D will duplicate. Now, whilst they're still selected, if you just click and drag down slightly, you'll get that black line appear. You can let go, and that will split everything up. If you notice, position 3 just needs to go back down there. Next thing we need to do is to group everything together. So if we grab the yellow layers and the yellow positioner, which if you notice it's now numbered positioner 4, whereas the original is positioner 1. That's important, you'll see why in a second. So with those layers selected, we go to layer, pre-compose, call it yellow reflect, move all attributes into the new composition, OK. Now when I double click on this, we're going to get an error message because we're going to break the expression. There we go. So you just click OK and we'll clear the error messages and we'll explain what's happened. If you open up the position property of one of the layers and click the drop down next to position, you'll see that the expression is still there, but the problem we have is it's looking for positioner 1. We've brought this in with the number positioner 4. So if we change the name, positioner 1, nothing happens. What we now need to do is click this little equal sign here, which is enable expression. Now that switches the expression back on. When it's back on, the numbers will turn red and he'll jump to the right place. So we just need to do that for the other layers. Let's drop down, enable. Right, and they're all in the right position now. Next thing we need to do is select them, hit S for the scale properties, and then we go through and we uncheck the constrain properties button, which looks like a little chain. Reason for that is because we need to change just one value in the scale, which is the Y scale value. I'll show you what would happen. If you watch this figure here, and I've got that selected, if I put what I need is a minus figure there, it's actually put a minus on the X as well, which we don't want because his hat is now pointing the wrong direction. It should be pointing to the right. So if I take the constraint off and remove the minus from the X value, he's now the right way around. So with that in mind, go through and put a minus in front of each of the Y scale values. Now if we go back to the main comp, they're looking the right way. You can tell by the hat. The hat's pointing that way, it's a reflection of that way. But the problem is the layer we've just brought in is a lot bigger, which we don't want. In order to repair that, we need to click the collapse transformations, which is that button there. That's brought everything back in line. Now just for the sake of clarity, I'm going to drag this to the bottom of the stack because the reflection should be underneath. I'm just going to solo the yellow layer at the moment so we can see what we're doing. That's better. That is. If we move back here, what you'll see is that the reflections are actually tracking with the figures. So they're actually in the right place. And you are getting that three-dimensional aspect to it, which looks rather nice. What we now need to do is add the actual reflection itself. So with your pre-comped layer selected, go to Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Fast Blur, add a blur of 6, which gives you the nice soft floor blur. Let's put this resolution to full. So already it's starting to feel like a proper reflection, but it's too reflective. So we then need to add Effect, Transition, and you go down to Linear Wipe. We set the wipe angle to 0. Move the completion up so you can see it chopping in half. And we put a nice feather, around about 100. And then we can move just move your transition completion to get a nice soft subtle reflection. Now if that seems to chop off too quickly for you, increase your feather and you can just play around and you can get some really nice subtle effects. So that's quite a nice reflection there at a completion position of 40% and a feather of 218. And once you're happy with that, you can select the effects layer, copy it and paste that onto all the other reflection layers that you're going to create, and then you're ready to move on to the next section. Okay, having done the reflection layers, we're now going to create the floor, which is fairly straightforward. You go to Layer, New, Solid. Have a white solid. I've got one at 3000 pixels by 6000. Doesn't need to be that. Let's go to Make Comp Size. Hit OK. We end up with a screen. Let's just screen full of white. Now if we click and drag that to the very bottom of the stack, there you go. And we've got very subtle reflections, which you can just see there. You can obviously boost those if you wish. And basically, you've not created a floor there. Let's just state that. All you've done is put a white background behind everything. The reason we think it's a floor is because of these reflections. And we're now going to enhance that even further by creating some shadows. So to do that, we need to go to Layer, New, Solid. It's going to be a white solid. This time I'm going to have a width of 3000 and a height of 6000 pixels. Hit OK. This one we're going to make a 3D layer. We'll open up its... Now what's happening now? We're getting slowing down because we're using quite a lot of resources on the system, so I'm going to lower my resolution to a third. Open the transform position properties for that white layer, set the X rotation to -90, and that will put it as a floor plane, which at the moment is just chopping through the lower part of some of the figures. That's because the position is 218. The figures here we actually put at 315. So if we bring this down to, let's just give it a few more pixels, 319. Now they should be sitting on top of that layer. So what we're going to do now is add a light by going to layer, new, light. We'll make it a spotlight with an intensity of 88, a cone angle of 65, feather of 50, leave it the colour it is, tick cast shadows, have a shadow darkness of 15% and a diffusion of 60, and click OK. Now that looks very weird, so what we need to do is I'll move the white layer down so that it's behind all the figures. I'm going to go to my top view, let's zoom out a bit so we can see what we're doing. I'm going to get the light, I'm going to move it over here, go to the active camera, lift the light up, I'll drag its position down so it's pointing at the floor, open the material options on the white solid layer by selecting the layer and hitting AA, and I'm going to turn off accept light. I'm going to leave on accept shadows, and then I'm just going to double check the position. Right, that's where I'm going wrong. For some reason I'd got the position in the wrong place for that layer. Now that I've moved this layer down so that it's below the position of the feet, the light itself is casting some shadows from the characters. They're a bit harsh, and we're not seeing the reflections. So if we, still with the white solid selected, we go for a mode, and we'll try screen. And that's not the one I need. Multiply, that's the one I need. I'm also going to try play with the opacity. I can make it, if we bring the opacity down to about about 30%, we end up with a nice subtle shadow. Let's just, it takes it a little while to render. So there, we can just see we've got some subtle reflections, probably a little bit too subtle, and we've got these nice little shadows. If at any point when you switch on your lights you find that the figures are very dark, then what you probably find is if we go to one of those, select the layer, AA for the options, you might find that the accept shadows and lights buttons are on, in which case if you've got the light, accept lights on, he goes dark because the light isn't actually shining on him. So we need to turn that off. That way they're not affected by the lights, they're only used to cast shadows. If you had the accept shadows on, then this character would be putting shadows across the others, which again is not something that we need. Final thing we need to do is add a three-dimensional logo, which I'm going to create using a single flat image. and no plugins. So if we go to File, Import File, ATUX logo, I want to bring this in as a composition cropped layer, which we have. Double click the ATUX logo comp to open it there. We're going to rename it as logo front, make it a 3D layer. I'm going to select it, hit AA to open its 3D options, and we're going to turn off accept lights. And we're going to close the layer, select it, duplicate the layer, rename the duplicate as logo side, put logo side on the bottom, close the visibility icon for the logo front for now. We're going to double click this logo to open it in a layer window like that. And if you notice, we've got this lighter line around the image. That's going to cause us problems doing the edge of the 3D comp because it's just going to blend into the background too much. So I'm going to get my brush tool, which is there, select a colour. Now I'm going to select one of these colours, and I'm going to make it lighter, and I'm just going to brush across the top of the logo and down this side. I'm then going to select the darker purple and make it even darker and paint across the bottom. And maybe just a touch up the side there. And that's all we need to do for that. Then if we select the logo side, hit P for its position, Alt click on the position stopwatch to open the expressions text box. I'm going to open my dashboard because I have this expression already entered, so I'll just copy it and paste it into the expressions window. And if you look at this, what it's saying, it's looking in this composition for the layer which is known as index -1. That relates to these here, these numbers. So these are your index numbers. Index -1 is the, well, we're on 2, so index -1 is 1. It's the layer above. And what it's saying is, look at its transform positions, or rather take the transform position into here, do nothing to the X and Y, but then add 1 to the Z value. So as you can here we've got 1. If we open position on here, we've got 0. Now we need to duplicate this layer, and if you notice it's gone to 2, which is exactly what we need. So we need an awful lot of these to create the depth, because we're creating the depth by offsetting each layer by a single pixel in the Z axis. So I'm going to do around about 30 copies. And that should be all we need. Now if we go back to the Smiley final, let's turn off that layer there. Now if we grab hang on, before I grab anything, we'll go to the end of the timeline. So we've got the end of the camera move around about there. Grab in this ATUX logo comp. Now you're wondering what's going on there. That's because I forgot that we need to switch back on the visibility for the front layer. Much better. Now we're going to reposition this in 3D space, so we'll make it a 3D object, and because it's looking a little bit weird, it's not behaving quite right, we need to hit the collapse transformations, which makes all the 3D properties in the other comp active in this comp. I think that's what it does. And I'll reposition this to somewhere that I think will look quite good. So I want to alter my scale a little smaller. And I also want to play around with the position and the rotations. So the Y rotation is that one, and there you can see the three-dimensional depth we've given this logo. I'd quite like to finish the animation at that position there, so I'm going to add a keyframe for that, and possibly one for the position as well. If we go back up through the timeline, we can either start there and just rely on the camera moving round, which works quite nicely. In fact, that's probably what I'm going to do. Or you could add a little motion so that the logo is rotating as well. Right, so I'll just put this all back to full res, and I'm going to do a composition, add to render queue. Okay, the render's just finished. One thing I did forget to say was what I like to do on this composition is to put the motion blur on, and then put motion blur on for all the layers just before the final render. The reason for that is it gives it just this nice subtle soft blend during the move and the camera move. Just helps to make it feel as if it was shot more with a real camera. Here's the final render. I'll show you what we've done. Which I think looks quite nice. And you can just make out the soft reflections. You've got the three-dimensional shadows, and it all works really quite nicely. I'm Adam Taylor for AE Tuts Plus. Hope you enjoyed the tutorial and hope you learned a few things. Have a good one.